Hi, I'm Rajesh.
And I'm Richard,
This is Humanity.
being human in an age of artificial intelligence.
This season, we're discussing how AI makes culture. And in today's episode, we're talking about AI and identity. So, Richard, identity is huge in everything. It's huge in culture, it's huge in psychology. It is huge for a good reason because it is who we are.
Indeed, yeah. We were thinking that identity is it's so fundamental to culture, and so keeping with the theme for the season of how AI makes culture, that one way that we could look at it would be to sort of zoom down to the individual level and think about it from the sort of person's eye view. How is it that AI affects our identities?
hmm And we should also contrast that a little bit with the collective sense of culture, right? Like when we say the culture of the United States or how European culture is different from Asian culture or something like that, right? So we're not talking about those macro understandings of the word culture, though they're related to what happens at the individual level.
Not so much the anthropological sense of the term of contrasting different cultures. Um, Maybe a little bit like people used to speak about kind of capital C culture, like high culture. We certainly don't mean that. Well, we don't not mean that, but we mean that plus low culture and mid culture and kind of everything along those lines, everything in
And
between.
and we of course don't have a hierarchy of low, mid, and high culture that we are playing with either, right?
Right.
Culture is culture is culture.
Right. Of course, there are a lot of issues around AI and identity that have been a part of conversations on AI really for years. Big topics, things like personal identity, or by which I mean authentication, right, or access control, deep fakes, impersonation, identity theft. We're not going to talk about that kind of thing here.
No.
Similarly, personalization, echo chambers, right, the use of AI to reinforce biases, that kind of thing. Also, not really what we're focused on today.
Though the one thing that we do want to spend a little bit of time is on racial biases, not because we have something important to say about it, except that it's wrong, but that it actually does link to the greenfield side that we are interested in.
Right, and in particular, you're thinking about racial bias and face recognition. Is that what you're talking
That's
about? Yeah.
correct.
The issue there is that a lot of automated face recognition systems are bad at recognizing people with darker skin. And the main issue there really is that the training sets used for so many of these systems are heavily biased toward people with lighter skin. So they're trained on light-skinned people. They don't have nearly as much training data with darker skinned people. And so, in a sense, it's not surprising that they're just not as good at recognizing darker skinned people. There are problems both with false positives and with false negatives. But we wanted to explore not the details of that problem, but whether it could be an example of other problems, maybe shortcomings or just limitations for this kind of system.
Yeah, I mean, I actually have an example. So I use Midjourney a lot, and whenever I type in either boy or girl or some indicator of a human being, uh, it is always throwing up images that have very good looking, usually stereotypically Western features. There's a slight bias towards light skin, but I think that more so than skin, I believe there the bias is towards looks.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it's typically going to be an attractive person. That's kind of the gist of it?
Yeah, and attractive young person.
Aha. Uh-huh.
So there's an ageism also to it. Unless you say old man or old woman, you're not going to get that.
Uh-huh. The sort of default is a younger, at least somewhat Western looking and attractive person.
That's correct.
Does it tend to be more female also?
No,
Okay. Uh-huh.
no. I should look at it more carefully, but my sense is it is maybe even more biased towards men than towards women.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And are you thinking that maybe this is a result of the training data? That the images of those kinds of people are more prevalent than older people or non-Western people and especially less attractive people?
Definitely out there in the world, there's attractive people are overrepresented. But I also wonder if it might be two layers of biases, right? One is the vast trove of training data that you're using to train your models on, but also perhaps within the user community of Midjourney, there might be a bias towards creating images with attractive people in it.
Yeah. Something that I've noticed as someone who studies attractiveness and reads and writes scientific articles about attractiveness is that it's pretty common in those articles that if you look at the example stimuli, they will generally
Mm-hmm.
be relatively attractive stimuli. So let me just to
Mm,
give you an example. There's certain face databases, standardized sets of
mhm.
photographs of faces that are commonly used in the scientific literature. And for certain databases, I can usually predict which example face will appear in an article. And it will typically be a young and attractive female face. Sometimes it's a young and
Aha.
attractive male face. It's the kind of thing. I've never done a survey of other researchers, sort of why did you choose that face, but I have always assumed that it comes from a similar place as, well, why do you see that in film and television, right? Why do you see that in advertising, right? If you look at you look at a magazine or you look uh, music video, you're not going to see many older people, and you're certainly not going to see very many unattractive people unless they're in a sort of a special role, like a some kind of
Yeah.
character role.
There might be some subgenres of attractiveness, like the older and distinguished person, right? Like they look distinguished, they look authoritative, powerful, all of those things.
Just kind of looping this back though to the issue of that we started this with of racial bias and face recognition. That the sort of concern here is that I don't know if concern is the right word, but just something to be aware of that it's easy to see the output of something like Midjourney or conversation in a chatbot as being sort of value neutral or as being an objective reflection of society, but this is a case in which that's really not true, right? That we see certain kinds of images much more are appearing much more frequently in our media and those media that are being used to train the AI systems. And as a result, they tend to output those kinds of images.
Hmm. And if there's second order training, which is to say the systems take their users' inputs as feedback for the next round of training, then if there's bias on part of the users towards attractive, young, white, any of those dimensions, then you're going to see even more of that, right? So you're doubling down on the bias.
Right. Training in two ways, right? The
Hmm.
end user training, and also the training set. Yeah, and in addition to images, that this is something that I can't imagine that's not an issue with respect to the use of training sets for the large language models. That certain kinds of texts are going to be more represented than others.
Hmm. And text in general is going to be represented more than non-textual human experience.
Right. Right. Other forms of linguistic culture, that's not going to be represented. And that's going to be associated in turn with like social class or geography, possibly with age, with other kinds of dimensions of identity. So the kinds of answers and the concerns that are latent, that are implicit in these large language models, are going to reflect some people better than others and some cultural concerns more than others.
But there are also the defaults, right? Even with the training sets and even with the user training on top of it, when I talk to ChatGPT, it responds like an upper middle class, um, at least college educated person, right? That's the style of language, the use of words. You could ask it to talk in a certain way, but the default seems to be a certain upper class persona.
Generally speaking, texts are produced more by middle or upper class people. Right?
Hmm.
If you think about
Hmm.
who's sort of almost by definition that to be writing, to be a public voice, is means to be middle class or higher. There are exceptions to
Mm.
that. Right now, we have this strike by the United Auto Workers. Trade unions have been a place where working class people have had a kind of a public voice, but that's really kind of the exception to the rule
Hmm.
here. And so I think what you're pointing out here might be an example of this, right? Of the artificial intelligence based on the training set, showing us not really not a mirror of who we are collectively, but a mirror of who some of us are, who are more involved in producing text.
Hmm. And producing text with purposes that are perhaps not the same as the purposes of non-text producing people when they use language.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think this is how is it that the training of these generative AI systems is shaping the outputs, and how is that in turn going to uh, affect the making of culture by AI?
Mm. I mean, I'm just thinking, let's take an example of a resource I use a lot, and Wikipedia. If I read a Wikipedia article, it has that kind of authoritative um, upper middle class voice to it.
Right, right. Different people with their different identities are encountering this sort of authoritative voice. Yeah. Changing the subject slightly, I wonder whether you think that artificial intelligence might afford more fluid identities. Is there some sense in which it might actually help people explore or try out different identities for themselves?
I absolutely do. And it's building upon what's been going on at least since the early internet, right? There were people in user forums in the pure text-based internet of the 1993, let's say,
Right.
who were very different in person from what they were in the forum, right? And so the disembodied nature of digital media allows, I think, uh, the possibility of different identities in different situations. But AI, I think, just supercharges that. And like I can use Chat GPT to say, okay, Chat GPT, um, talk to me like you are my teenage self. Right? You could just get a lot more feedback on many different identities and play them in a systematic way. Like it might become common for people to do so, right? That
Mm-hmm,
to have
mm-hmm.
many avatars.
And that's kind of something that we associate, or at least I associate it to some extent with youth and being almost like a typical, kind of a developmental stage that's common maybe through the teen years of trying on different identities, even in person, right? Even when you're, it might be wearing different clothes or trying different ways of speaking and so on. That's part of discovering an identity, or involves trying on different
Hmm.
identities as though they're a pair of clothes.
So talking about clothes and identity, I remember when I first, like when I when I got my first job, academic job, right? I went on this sports coat buying spree. I was like, I'm going to be a professor,
Yeah.
and so I'm going to buy a lot of sports coats. No
No tweed with
tweed,
elbow
no
patches.
tweed. But I did not have money, so I went on eBay and bought designer sports coats for like were pre-used,
Uh-huh.
right?
Uh-huh.
So secondhand. And I still have some, and I feel like that it gave me this opportunity to be a different person,
Mm-hmm.
and and it makes me think that uh, AI will give me many more such opportunities. The metaverse and the matrix mythology makes it clear that you could be a different kind of entity in this digital universe, and but I feel like actually the capacity to generate those fluid environments needs AI. So
Mm.
even though it is metaverse, the technology you need to generate those fluid 3D environments that you can inhabit is going to be more AI than metaverse.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. You bring up the metaverse, and earlier you talked about the, you know, 90s chat rooms and sort of the notion. I'm kind of circling back to that in my mind and thinking about the sort of uncanniness of realizing that, you know, first that someone that you were chatting with, that they, you know, they could say that they're a child, but it might actually be a grown man, or, you know, it might be someone of a
Mm-hmm.
different gender, and then realizing that you could do that as well, and having this sort of ability to put on different skins, different identities, um, even without the, you know, the metaverse kind of you know, visual appearance of it, but that really just, you know, is kind of supercharged when you have an avatar that's, you know, beyond the text. What you get with the chat room is the disembodiment, but then the metaverse sort of re-embodies you,
Mm-hmm.
but with a choice about how, you know, what body it is. Is it, you know, you can play with gender or an age, but you can also, you could even play with species, or, you know, things that are even more radical.
Yeah, this to me is the most exciting thing about AI. And I've heard other people talk about it too, which is, I mean, when you think about the telescope, it was invented primarily for commercial purposes. Like merchants were interested in finding out what ships are coming over the horizon so that they could price those goods accordingly, right? But it was Galileo who took that and pointed it at Jupiter's moons and our moon. And suddenly it was this scientific instrument and not just a commercial one. And I feel like AI's version of the Galilean telescope is going to be uh, peering into the minds of other species, right? If there's a way for us to jointly embody ourselves in another
Mm.
species.
Mm.
There's, of course, a lot of interest in communicating with other species. There's the SETI project, CETI, not SETI,
Mm.
which was about extraterrestrial intelligence. And so there are people who are trying to understand whale language and like have real time conversations with whales and things like that. And I think that's important, and it's definitely machine learning driven. But I can imagine also just being that body, like going back to the bodily sense of identity, if I could get the sensory inputs of another species, so let's say a dog or something further, an octopus, for a day, would my sense of my bodily identity change?
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and that probably will require interfaces that are different from what we have at present. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
going to be through a chatbot that you would have that, but some, maybe some kind of neural interface, for example.
Could be a neural interface for other visual creatures. It might just be something similar to a VR lens,
Mm-hmm. Uh huh.
right? Uh, but for creatures that are quite different from us, I can't even imagine the interface. But I'm just saying, just as um, computing technology went from just text-based interfaces, which is what computers were till whatever late 70s, to graphical user interfaces, and it's really the graphically enhanced uh, personal computers that have become universal. I'm again going to go out on a limb and say it's when AI acquires these multimodal interfaces that it's going to feel like a essential part of our world.
Mm. And there, it's really a kind of an interface change that might be empowered through AI. Maybe we could start answering questions like, what is it like to be a bat, or an
Mm-hmm.
octopus, or some other species.
In fact, that famous question of what it's like to be a bat, Thomas Nagel's question, I think is now a technology question and not a philosophy question.
What do you think in for the more near term? Do you think that the existing interfaces like the chatbots and the image generators, do you think that they might uh, allow us to realize different possible selves?
I think so. If you think of writing as expressing a self, we know that writers are not the same as writers as they might be as human beings, right? We already know that. And you could say the same thing about images. So I'm thinking that you could put on authorial or creative personas at the very least that are multifarious.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For example, the chatbot might allow us to, let's say, practice saying something or similar message, but with different voices. So we could even just giving a prompt that may be the same prompt to produce the same kind of text, but from different authors, different kinds of people, that we could sort of internalize that and imagine it coming from us as sort of different versions of ourselves.
Yeah. Since I'm not a skilled image producer, so neither am I a great illustrator nor am I a great photographer, I have really gotten into image production only because of AI, right? I don't have a pre-AI image production persona. And I find that I have two distinct styles with Midjourney. I've kind of fallen into it. And it's kind of easy because like some of my colleagues are now noticing that this is Rajesh's form of mid-journey production.
Hmm. These two distinct styles.
These two, these two distinct styles,
Uh-huh.
right? And, I mean, of course, those are really tied to the kind of the kind of prompts I use and how I select based on Midjourney's outputs. But still, it's definitely a style.
Mm-hmm.
Very early, but it's not the same as what other people are producing, for example.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. That's interesting. Yeah. I wonder also, having a more fluid identity, that possibility, it makes me think a little bit about the notion of gender fluidity. I mean, it's not a new idea, but it's sort of newly become a mass idea, right? That's something
Mm-hmm.
outside of gender theorists are talking
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about. I wonder whether that that sort of notion might is that going to increase or even sort of multiply across other forms of identity, right? Not just gender, but maybe other categories.
Yeah, I think so. If you think of identity fluidity as one of the natural consequences of the knowledge society that we are in, right? That we need to be adaptable, we need to be smart, so to speak, in certain ways, then, and that is privileged because it has commercial and other value too, then but there's an inexorable direction for some people to exhibit more identity fluidity in every
Mm.
dimension.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think it's interesting you bring up class or social class because I I find the more I think about artificial intelligence, the more I think that it's an interesting aspect of identity to consider and partly from kind of almost sort of contradictory ways. I mean, one of the things that I think we've seen in recent decades, in at least in American society, is that sort of traditional modes of upper class marking are sort of less popular. I mean, if you think about the clothing that, let's say, you might see the tech billionaires wearing, I mean, it's pretty unremarkable looking. I mean, I'm sure they pay more money for their jeans and t-shirts, but it just from a category perspective, it's the kind of thing that you could see in a high school or a college campus. And yet there's also a sense in which that those modes of being that are maybe typified by Silicon Valley are becoming a kind of new, I don't want to say a new upper class, because I think it's something else, but a dominant social class and dominant modes of being. And I think the adoption of new technologies and having a kind of cultural fluidity is one piece of that.
As somebody who maximizes the wearing of t-shirts and jeans, I sometimes feel like, am I trying to be too young for my age? I don't feel that, but sometimes other people feel that way. But also, in many situations, comes across as being too informally dressed. But what do you think? Is it like a signal of being immature, or you know, not trying to be professional?
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. That the association of those clothes with tech and with the kind of youthful culture that technology, at least the sort of Silicon Valley variant of technology, is associated with. Of course, there are other varieties of sort of older technologies, technological cultures, like the IBM culture, for example, of the
Hmm.
mid 20th century, that was very formal. Um, but yeah, the sort of jeans and t-shirt Silicon Valley thing, it does to me seem to be a signal of youthfulness, and maybe there's something about a kind of flexibility. I wonder whether that's going to continue with, as we increasingly live in an age of AI, uh, that this sort of more youthful style might be more prevalent. And it kind of, to me, it raises this a question of, what does it mean to be a mature person? What does it mean to be adult in an age of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, being adult was, at least until recently, maybe even now, explicitly contrasted with youth, right? And so maturity was a signal of adulthood, and adulthood was not being young. And therefore, um, if logic is transitive, then you know that being mature is not compatible with being young.
Right.
So, um, I, I feel like some of those mores are going to have to change, because um, otherwise you're going to have a situation where being old is uh, maybe mature, but maturity, it's not the thing that makes you successful.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, what do we associate with maturity? I mean, of course, just age itself, right?
Yes.
That's the main thing. But there are other traits as well, like dependability,
Hmm.
stability, knowledge. I think this is a big one, right? Knowing things. A mature person, part of it is that they know stuff, right? And that, I don't know whether their value is different. I mean, I would hope that maturity is something that continues to be valued,
Yeah.
that we want to keep growing older and see value in the aging process and in experience. Um, but I guess I'm wondering if maybe there's a different way in which we might think of maturity. Like maybe being mature could be having been through changes and survive them, right? Knowing what it is to live through times of change and being able to reinvent oneself.
Right. I want to go back to a universal icon of maturity, Socrates, who says that the only thing I know is I don't know, right? So even in the classical tradition, there's a sense of not knowing that's part of the process of maturation. That
Mm,
wisdom is not just in knowing, but in recognizing one's lack of knowledge
mm-hmm,
and curiosity about what there is.
mm-hmm,
So,
mm-hmm. Right, and certainly those are traits which will, I think, can only be more important in a time of accelerated change. What I think we're seeing, and I suspect we'll continue to see with artificial intelligence, is really just an extension of changes that we've been seeing throughout the modern world, certainly since the Industrial Revolution, with
mhm.
the increasing role of technology, of automation, of mechanization. Really, we're seeing the growth of those approaches into the knowledge economy.
Hmm.
Right? So that the white collar kinds of jobs are at risk of being eliminated through automation.
And that's where a cognitive trait that, at least in the sciences, is celebrated. I don't know how often it's practiced, but it's this idea that you want to be proven wrong, right? In fact, you have a situation where you ask a question and it turns out that you have the wrong hypothesis. Well, you move on to the next one. Uh,
Yeah.
in practice, that's hard to do because we are all very attached to our hypotheses. But I'm wondering if the ideal version of that attitude is actually uh, a useful, if not important one. And to me, that's a sign of maturity, right? A sign, even in a classical sense, that accepting when you're wrong and letting go of your wrong beliefs strikes me as a pretty mature way of living your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is often something that we have to learn to do. Right? It
Yeah,
doesn't come naturally to admit that we are wrong, that we failed at something. Right? It's kind of a close cousin anyway of failure
yeah,
and learning from failure. And I think that that's certainly something that I would hope continues to be associated with maturity.
yeah. We should then be more continuously exposed to failure, right? Like we
Mm.
should have more opportunities to fail, but with some kind of social security net or something else that allows you to fail.
Yeah.
Failure is great if you can get up and do the next thing. It's terrible if it means you are homeless.
And that really kind of strikes at the heart of the fears about artificial intelligence, I think, or not all of the fears, but many of the fears are about: am I going to lose my job? Number one, and number two, am I going to lose my relevance? Will I no
Yes.
longer matter to society? And I think, talking about the social safety net, I think that the solutions to some of the problems that AI is bringing will not come from AI. They won't be technological. They'll be social. They'll be political. We
Yeah.
need to find a way for people to feel secure about these changes and feel like they can continue to thrive even if they lose the current job that they have today. And I think
Yeah.
that's really important.
I keep seeing these posters now. Unions, the people who brought you the 40-hour work week or something like that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you had to organize yourself to prevent the exploitation that was endemic during the industrial era. It's like,
Right.
oh, we're not going to work 15-year-olds for 13 hours a day and have them die of lung disease. That's just not okay.
Right.
And maybe we need the AI version of those new social formations that will come up with a new bargain.
The deal that just happened this past week between the Writers Guild of America and the producers, the film companies in Hollywood,
Yeah,
that explicitly cuts a path for how we can specify a role for workers' rights in an age of AI. That's something that makes me feel optimistic. Maybe that's a good point to end on, Rajesh.
yeah. Optimism is always good,
Okay.
and knowledge industries that are unionized, like the Writers Guild, that might lead the way to what's going to come next.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You have been listening to Humanity, being human in an age of artificial intelligence. We'll see you next week as we continue discussing how AI makes culture.